I'm just going to show you a kind of a teaser up front, a bit about what this is all about. You're in a minority of people who've seen it. We've just recently released it at Sundance and over the next few days at Tribeca Film Festival. So take a look at the teaser.
Welcome to your cell. You're going to be here for 23 hours a day.
You are going to undergo many different kinds of reactions, and some of them will be more immediate than others.
Keep your eye on survival.
Memorize your space. After a while, things start to slip.
I find myself floating.
The toilet then trips. People turn on themselves. It's almost like you want to feel alive.
You do something to make them notice you. So, now that you're here, what are you going to do? What can you do?
6 by 9. A virtual experience of solitary confinement.
So yeah, as you can see, it's really an awareness piece around solitary confinement that's created. Essentially, it's like a documentary in VR.
Yeah, the core of this is a journalistic project. So myself, Francesca, and Lindsay here, they're the special producers on this project. And The Guardian has a long history of talking about solitary confinement, especially with the US. And at the moment, there are up to 80 to 100,000 people in solitary confinement in the US, and they can spend between 20 and 24 hours in a cell, going from days to up to years. So the idea was to interview these former inmates, and there's 7 of them, and working with other organizations like Solitary Watch and the PBS, we got source materials and then worked together to sort of build up the idea of creating this virtual space.
Yeah, so I mean, what was really important here was, unlike most entertainment pieces, is the journalistic rigor had to be in place. This had to be true. So, I mean, we're going to get later on into some of the complexities of taking a documentary and putting it into a VR space, but even aside from that, the sheer material that's needed to create a cohesive, strong piece, there's incredible amounts of research that go into it. But first off the bat, we had to figure out how to take all this research and find a way to get it into one cell. So here are some of the actual prisoners who were in there. One of the things that happens in this is that within the journey is everything in the cell, everything that is there is true to what would be in a cell or is on record from interviews. You are talked through the process by ex-prisoners as if they're in the cell with you. So even the narration is authentic from an original source. Here are some examples of some of the people who were interviewed for it. So that then brings us on to kind of how do you then translate that into the environment? Now, I'm sure a lot of people have talked today about how to direct within VR or the differences between traditional linear narrative and having a more kind of fragmented experience, or in fact, how do you embrace gaming as a way to direct? But, first off, I guess that's an example of we quite early on made the decision to not do it as 360 video and rather do it as a game engine-based piece. And there are real reasons on the Guardian side for that.
Yeah, creating, there's real limitations of getting cameras into prison cells. The cells themselves change from state to state, from prison to prison, so there is no one single cell. But using the original source material, the photos you saw earlier, and using video footage we've got from other places, we built up a composite of like an average cell. But again, going back to this idea of that this is a really journalistic enterprise and everything is true to the source material, once we had this composite cell sort of built up, we sent this to Soldier Box, we sent this to the former prisoners and asked them, is this a realistic representation of where you were? And they said yes, and that kind of allowed us to move forward with what we had.
Yeah. The main thing that we're trying to do with all of this is to create empathy. And VR is fantastic for that, because as we'll go through, there are so many ways where you can be a part of the story or be in the story, where you can remove barriers to having an attachment to story. This is just an example of the basic build in Unity. One of the biggest benefits of working in a game-based engine versus 360 film is to have a sense of interactivity and to actually read it truly as spatial. And I'm sure there's been a lot of debate today as well around true VR versus 360 film and what the differences are. And people do say that true VR is game engine based, but obviously there are pros and cons to both. For us, this worked perfectly because it's been recorded that reading things spatially in VR, you read it as memory. All the way down to why you would get motion sickness or have a sense of vertigo. All those things are a very visceral experience of that space. And so for us, even though there might be fidelity issues around rendering, you still believe that you're in a room or in a very small room.
And one of the benefits of using a real-time engine like Unity is it really helped with collaboration. Early on, the mill created this a rough version of the cell for us, and we installed at the Guardian Unity, and it allowed Francesca and myself to start to position the audio around in that space. It was something that Francesca's used to doing traditional audio, so real-time positional thing where the person looks around is a new idea. And the only way you can really figure out what works and what doesn't is to actually do it. So using something like Unity here and collaborating allowed us to set up the scene, put audio in the right place, and then send those positional data over to the mill, and then to continue to integrate it into their flow.
Yeah. That really, we're going to look also at some traditional structure. That really, in fact, that's a condensed version at the bottom of the timeline. That's kind of how it was planned. And there's some important kind of changes that happen when you then try and squash that into a non-linear space. And there needs to be quite a bit of experimentation around that. This is an example of just some of that programming and building. Again, this idea of empathy. There are a few rules that we figured out quite early on that how to make the space real. So, and we'll get into some more depth on this as well, but so for instance, even down to UI or the user journey, not to try and, wherever possible, obey our understanding that this is a real space. So for instance, that there are not title systems or click-through states or any sense of UI. Things like that would break the illusion. They would break this idea of actually being there. You'll then be detached and you'll be in more control than what you really are. So this really is, within that user journey, we look to try and mimic the experience of someone in confinement. Because essentially you're going to be in it for about 6 minutes, but we needed to really feel like it really kind of encompasses what happens to someone in that space. Because there's an entire, the whole point of this is to try and let people see how prolonged experience, prolonged time with sensory deprivation has real negative psychological effects. In fact, the UN states that it's a form of torture. Now, to mimic that the first part of our narrative is to kind of be fairly linear about it. So it's traditional narration.
I chipped his tooth and split his chin open.
Welcome to your cell. You're going to be here for 23 hours a day.
Yeah, I'm never going back to population again.
As a psychologist, I can tell you that you are going to undergo many different kinds of reactions. And some of them will be more immediate than others.
So as things happen to you, and some I can't even predict, what you have to do is keep your eye on survival.
Memorize your space.
You're such a fool, man.
count the bricks in your cell. You'll see the paint strokes in it.
So as you can hear, all the surrounding audio is so important to this piece.
So,
Everything is built up from actual
Now
source
that you're
material,
here,
as if you're there. The binaural audio,
What are
being
you gonna
spatially
do?
aware. There was really special care brought in to
Okay.
make sure that you can build up this environment in a compelling way that is also authentic. In that same user journey, what we then do, what I'm going to show you is these are all fragmented parts of this. Obviously, this is the great thing about VR, and also the tricky thing about showing it, is that you need to be in the space to experience it. There are no cuts. You can't turn a camera in a certain direction or frame certain things up. And all the way down to, there's like, even if you think of, there's certain things that we take for granted as filmmakers. So one of the first concepts in kind of narration is the idea of framing. So all the way down to, back in the day, vintage film. If you walk someone into frame from left to right, that's the way we in the Western world will read. So you read them as a protagonist. Now, if you walk them the opposite way, initially you have this gut feel that they're kind of a negative person. There's a negative connotation and it's an awkward movement. There's all these tricks that over kind of decades of making films that second nature style, that we all have to undo and find new ways of telling within VR. What we then do after giving someone, so again, looking at the mapping out of the narration to mimic what it's like to be in a prison, we start off with giving you kind of an induction part. So that's really just telling you where you are, giving you a chance to look around, get engaged, figure out and acclimate to the environment. The next thing we do is to give you control. So that's in the form of hotspots.
So this ties back into the idea of using a real-time engine,
Dear
which
Cheyenne,
allows us
I'm
to
just
have
writing to you to say thank you for
interactive
everything,
elements and gives
and I love you.
the user
I was on my
agency,
way to
and
sleep.
this pulling them in a
started to
place,
look
they
at my
have some form of control. So we put elements around the cell. There is a wash basin, there's a letter, there's some books, magazines on the floor. If you look at them, it triggers this hotspot and you trigger some audio. But it's up to you what you look at and when you look at it. But this is the first time in this experience where you have some influence over what's happening to you and you have some control. And it's a very deliberate choice we made to have this early on, because then we transition you on to the next stage where ultimately we're going to take that away from you. And again, it goes back to this idea of trying to condense this long, prolonged experience, which is several years, into a short period of several minutes.
Yeah. Let's just let a bit of this run with the audio as well, because it's really interesting to see how just fairly ordinary objects suddenly take on such significant meaning in that environment.
Comb your hair and get up like you're going somewhere.
Hygiene.
I'll start that again for you.
Dear Cheyenne, I'm just writing to you to say thank you for everything and I love you. I was on my way to sleep, but I started to look at my pictures, and for some strange reason, I just had your...
Every day, wash up in the sink, like take a bath. It's called a bird bath.
We have to clean this up because this is your space. We'll take a sheet.
Prison library comes by once a week.
Ask your neighbor, do you have, any books that I could read or magazines?
Roll up your mattress, fold up your blanket into a pad, and most people exercise for at least an hour a day. You have to exercise and you have to do it in a certain way.
500 jumping jacks.
500 to 1,000 push-ups.
So again,
16 count
what's
burpees.
happening here
You have to do
in a
a
really
workout
kind
for
of
strength.
subtle way is that you're building familiarity with the objects and humanity into the story. Again, bearing in mind that the entire subject matter of this as a documentary piece is normally so foreign for us, and so kind of to actually really understand
Comb your hair and
the predicament that these prisoners are in, or how detrimental this process is, it's quite a hard thing to get your head around, because to ask someone to have empathy for a prisoner in our modern culture is pretty tricky stuff. So then you can see that we start to get into here is how do you deal with information that's written, that isn't narrated or isn't film or isn't just experience-based interactivity. And again, one of the rules that we tried to obey was it is a real space. So let's project type against the walls so that you can at least respect and not break the rules of what that space is doing. These are some of the early concept boards of getting there. this is just an exploration into all the things that can keep you locked in prison. We wanted to show again how easy it is to get stuck in there. What happens a lot of the time, and what you find with the prisoners is that they'll be locked in, they'll go in for about 3 months, 4 months, but because of the negative association, well, it's more kind of the slow deterioration of your psyche in that environment, you then act out. Bearing in mind, going in there, you're really not probably one of the most stable candidates to be kind of in solitary confinement, but for anybody in solitary confinement, it does eventually break away at you psychologically. There are things like, what you'll find is anything, so kind of swearing, sex, fighting, all these things that will happen over time because someone is acting out, all the way down to things like people find that they're missing human contact quite a bit. That's also sensory deprivation. So they'll cut themselves to get into medical just to be around people, which then gets them locked up for more time. And it's this vicious cycle, just keeps them going around. So again, really how we find the information.
One of the interesting things is one of the main ideas behind this piece for The Guardian is to inform. We're bringing information to people, we're giving them a chance to learn and then make up their own minds or ask questions. And The Guardian has lots of supporting material that comes along with this, but the main principle is to inform and generate interest and cause people to start to question things.
Yeah, that was a really interesting thing in this collaboration, is that you can't hyperbolize things, you can't dramatize things just for effect or emotional effect. Like if you're working in the entertainment industry, you can make things scary, you can turn into a horror to like really shock somebody. But for this, it had to be unbiased. We had to represent things as it was recorded, which then brings us to the next section in that whole linear, or that whole kind of broken linear narrative. So once we've given people an induction, we've then given them control, so a way to find out information through the hotspots. We then remove control, and that's control of their bodies and the environment. Now, what happens next is we go into kind of showing how the internal process of a prisoner breaks down. And bearing in mind, everything that then happens after this is recorded. So we start off with a kind of hallucination section.
After a while, things start to slip.
You think you hear them calling you from the officer station.
Sorry, can you turn the volume up a bit, please?
The toilet that drips because it sweats and it hits the floor.
I'm just going to run that again.
After a while, things start to slip.
You think you hear them calling you from the officer station.
The toilet that drips because it sweats and it hits the floor. Stupid.
I find myself floating.
Thinking about my mom, I see her in the corner of my eye.
A person would sometimes be in my cell with me.
You see like the paint on the wall.
So
it's
there are a few things happening
maybe
here.
50 years before I got
The first thing is blurring of vision.
vision.
What we did is we purposely courted a lot of the negative side effects of VR. So everyone talks about the motion sickness that happens, this kind of disembodied state, all these things we kind of messed with ever so slightly in a subtle way to generate unease and anxiety so that you do feel like there's something wrong with you or with your vision. The body floats off the room. So that again is totally unnatural. There's a lot of stimulus happening. There's cracks in the walls, there's writing on the sides of the walls as well. All these things are happening around you, and that moves on to a really interesting thing which we'll talk about in a bit, which is almost directing body language. So that's a lot of what that then causes the user to do is look around a lot, and this is an agitated state physically. It is. You've gone from being quite calm to being quite like in control of looking and finding information to now looking around and wondering what's going on. There's a hallucination scene. You hear the prisoner talk about how at times he feels like there's a presence in the room, there's someone else in the room. At the corner of his eye seems his mother. And this offered us a really unique opportunity because, unlike in traditional film where you have to do quite a lot to set that up, we could actually have that happen to you in the cell. So what we did was we built in, you'll see at the corner of your eye, you notice
a person would sometimes be in my cell with me.
You know, you see like the paint on the wall. That paint probably been there maybe 50 years.
So what
before I
happens
got
is
it.
when you look there, you
start
see it out the
seeing
corner of your eye,
figures.
but when you look there, it disappears. So again, that same frustration of not being able to tell what is there, and again, kind of feel like this anxiety is building. There's something so amazing about VR giving you a sense of presence. In traditional film, it takes a filmmaker quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of time to get you to care about his story. Now, if you look in VR, people immediately are curious. The moment they put it on, the moment the experience begins, they're trying desperately to figure out where they are and what they're doing. So that's already investment in the story. There's some other things that are happening here as well. So the cracks in the walls. Again, going back to trying to be true to the journalism of the piece. This is some early concept art. One of the prisoners describes seeing, like, you're so deprived of simulation that they stare at the walls for ages. They stare at the cracks and they start to see things in the cracks. One of the prisoners describes seeing Abraham Lincoln in a crack. So we actually built that in. You can, if you squint your eyes and look at it hard enough, there's the profile of an Abe Lincoln there. That is in the cell. So again, you're not going to pick that up if you're in the VR experience. But again, we're just trying to be true to the source material. Brings up a really interesting issue around you are there in the space. If you look at any kind of the original source material around bloodletting and violence within cells, there's actually they tend to flood cells out and cut themselves as a way to it's a protest, and it's a way to get the guards to storm in, take them to medical. All of that stuff is interaction with people. And what we found is when we were trying to mimic the similar thing in the cell, that kind of the opposite of what we wanted was starting to happen. So it's because there's no detachment of screen. You're not on your sofa looking at a screen watching a story. You're actually in the space. The more blood we would use, it's actually a barrier. So it's fairly horrific, and a lot of people don't want to be around blood. It's as simple as that. And so what we found is we had to minimize the amount of gore, however factual it is, because it was just a barrier to the story.
It also fits into the as you saw, the madness scene. There is so much going on in that moment. You're floating, vision is blurred, there's movements, cracks in the walls. There is actually some blood in that scene, but we toned it down because we didn't want that to be the main focus. And as you said, it almost detracts from the message we were trying to get across.
Absolutely. So, which brings us to another nice part, that in the Tribeca version, we have, and this is again another wonderful learning in the VR space, there's a common thing that comes through in a lot of the interviews is that at night time is almost the only respite to being in a cell, because you dream. You go to sleep and you dream. The first thing they all record, most of them record, is that you dream you're flying or you're out in the open. But what sadly happens is over time, the longer that they are incarcerated for, they start to dream that they are in prison, which is really quite sad. So we wanted to try and again build empathy around this. And there's a sequence where we project what feels like memories in the cell. And a very interesting thing happens here is that if you think about body language, when someone's looking down, it's a bit more negative. When you're looking up, it's a bit more positive. You're more open. So we try and raise the projection up. And there's a really interesting thing that happens with someone when they're watching this, is they do it. There's a sense of wonder that happens when you're in this state physically. And that's another great thing that comes out of working within VR, is you can physically get someone to engage with the story. You can get their body to help their brain along in the process. So yeah, just a bit of discussion around this, that you can immediately see how someone engages physically with something. It's just an observation again about, and I think the more we get into this and work in this space, we're going to see some really interesting ways to unlock story within somebody rather than it being just told to them. Like, let physicality be something that engages someone in the content. Again, the first thing you notice when anybody kind of gets into the space is the moment it starts to happen, they're in, they're locked in. So then the key is just keeping them in and making sure that you hold them. And another thing just around body language. So I don't think we have, this kind of brings us to the end. I'm sure there'll be some questions, so please pipe up. But if you get a chance, it's going to be released soon. Andrew will fill us all in on how that's going to be going, but try it out. It's 6 minutes of your time. It's really interesting. And I think the other thing is that in this space, we're all, it's so new, VR, that the first thing anybody's doing is obviously gaming is exploding. And then the second thing that you're always doing is taking you somewhere that you can never go. And it tends to be quite hyperbolized. It tends to be like on the moon, or you're flying through space. And for us, what's so interesting is when things start to get a bit subtler. If you think about it, VR in itself is quite a meditative process. You put a headset on. For me, I'd rather do that at home behind a locked door without anybody else around. Now, that's a total different state to how you view a lot of content. So if you go watch a movie or if you're watching an ad, things like that, it's a lot less social and it's a lot more meditative. And I think that it's going to get really interesting how we build content for that.
And for the Guardian's perspective, it's, this is our first VR piece, but it's raising lots of questions and opportunities of how do you tell journalistic stories with this medium? How do we tie in traditional media with VR media? And with this piece, when it launches, there will be supporting material. So there will be a page with audio interviews with all the previous inmates. There will be several articles about the US prison system. So it's that combination of launching a VR piece, but in a sort of brand new future thinking, while also using traditional media to support it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right then, we have got time for a couple of questions and then our closing panel. So does anyone have any questions? Somebody, come on. All that immersive journalism. Am I going blind? I can't see any hands up. Hey, the man with his hand really up.
Hello. I kind of didn't want to ask it because it's one of these weird non-question statement things where I just drag a bit more out of you on the same subject. But we're working with the BBC right now on a journalistic VR piece as well, which and so much of what you say rings so true with the same kind of issues and the interest in trying to keep things as real as possible. And this is why I'm not quite sure if there's a question, but I'll keep going anyway. But that piece where you were talking about the blood, and Paul Dean previously was kind of touching on the thing as well about reality, and sometimes the real that you create is just a little bit too real. Yeah. And because we found this, we're dealing with refugees and a journey from Turkey to Greece, so it's kind of and I suppose where do I get the question? This it's about what did you use internally to make decisions on what is too real or incorrect for your audience?
Wow.
Well, it's an interesting question. Yes, I mean, a good example is if you look at the actual PBS frontline documentary Solitary Nation, and the scenes where they're washing out the cells with the blood. It's captured, it's footage, it's real, that's what happens. Because this is a 3D real-time engine, the visual effects, we early on decided that with prototypes that it couldn't capture what the video captured, and while we were also doing so many other things at the same time, visually in that scene, in the night scene, again, it sort of distracted from the message we were trying to get across, the psychological state we're in. We weren't telling that message about the violence that happens in that particular scene. It was about this psychological trauma that we're really focused on, the long-term, prolonged. Now, the blood is a consequence of that, but we're really focused on the psychological damage.
And I think there's a logic. You make decisions quite early on in the piece, and you set up certain rules for yourself, even though you're not doing it on purpose. I think any experienced storyteller does that. You set up certain rules about how you're going to tell the story, and and you know if something's kind of diverging quite far off of that. I also think that it's going to be interesting to see a lot of what we're all doing here is without a real audience yet. And I think that in the same way that the detachment of screen allows for a general viewer to be very desensitized, now being in the space, we almost have to resensitize and find a way to watch things. And I think we'll only really know what is appropriate as people kind of get more acclimated to the way of viewing things in this environment. In the same way that if you put someone in a crazy ride, they're going to get ill. But it seems logical at first, right? You kind of go, yeah, let's go on a crazy ride. That'll be great. But I feel like, there's that feedback loop that we all still need in this industry.
Right, well, thanks, guys. Before we applause, because that's when everyone scarpers, the next talk is the final one, and it's actually a panel, the Women in Games panel. So there's going to be some... these guys are escaping before their applause. There's going to be some 2 minutes of rearranging of chairs while we prepare for a panel, but please stay, because it's going to be a wicked panel, and it's the last one of the day. And that was amazing. Thanks so much to both of you.